Canada's population grew by more than 1 million last year, almost all of that thanks to immigration. 1 million people. Half of them chose to settle in Ontario. But amid housing shortages and a strained healthcare system, is this the destination they're expecting? And are we doing enough of the right things to make this work for them and for those already here? Let's ask. Alfred Lam, he's Executive Director of the Centre for Immigrant and Community Services and Board Chair for OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Dina Ladd, Executive Director of the Workers' Action Centre. Mike Moffat, Senior Director at the Smart Prosperity Think Tank and an Assistant Professor at Western University's Ivey Business School. And Michael Skuterud, Economics Professor at the University of Waterloo and Director of the Canadian Labour Economics Forum. And it's great to have you four here in our studio for this discussion. Mike, to you first. The federal government says its goal is to increase immigration to 500,000 people per year within a couple of years. We had 1 million people come to Canada last year. So who are the other more than 500,000 people who joined us last year?
Yeah, so we have both permanent residents, which are, classic sort of immigration, but we have a variety of non-permanent residents. So these are people who are in Canada on some form of time-expired visa. So this could be things like people like temporary foreign workers, refugees, including refugees from Ukraine. Biggest cohort these days tends to be international students. So they're considered non-permanent residents, but that's a bit of a misnomer because they will often stay in Canada and eventually immigrate to Canada. So I like to think of them more as pre-permanent than non-permanent.
Gotcha. Now, we know we have targets for immigration. Do we have targets for this other cohort of people?
Well, for groups like international students, we don't. It's largely those decisions are made by the colleges and universities, so they can decide how many that they want to bring in. So it's a different system than immigration.
I want to ask the three of you a very neutral, lean, open-ended question that goes right back to first principles. Okay, Dina, start us off. What is the purpose in bringing immigrants to Canada?
Well, I mean, I think depends if it's voluntary or not. I mean, I think that Canada has a history of quite racist immigration policies, right, that have been race-based, that have excluded certain types of immigrants. We can just even remember what happened to the Chinese community during the building of the railway and all of the other infrastructures. And decade after decade, we've seen an immigration system based in this country that has excluded many, many races coming in and had unfair processes. So I think, obviously immigration is meant for people who are wanting to move into a country and make a better life. It could be on a variety of issues, economic, it could be humanitarian. But the thing is that we need immigration, as most countries do, to build the countries that we're living in and working in.
Let me get Alfred to pick up the story there. Again, in your view, why do we bring immigrants here?
Steve, I think when it comes to immigration, it matters through which lens we look at the issues, right? For most of the conversations, at least recently, it's very natural for us to default to the economic lens, right? We need population growth, we need people to fill gaps in the labor market, and so on and so forth. And so we need immigrants, right? But I think there's another set of lens that I think we need to learn to look through that we sometimes don't, and that is through the human rights lens. If Canada is serious about being a country that is building ourselves on immigration, then we need to learn some fundamental truths. So, for instance, we need to understand that a person's human rights is not a function of his or her immigration status, right? So whether someone is an asylum seeker or international student or permanent resident, they have inalienable and fundamental human rights. And for us, learning to uphold and protect that, it becomes a foundation through which we can then build for the long term.
That's part of what it means to be a Canadian, in your view?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mikhail, what would you add?
I guess my perspective is a little different, Steve. The Canadian immigration system actually has three arms. It has humanitarian class programs, it has family class programs, and it has economic class programs. And each one of those programs are trying to achieve different objectives. So the reality of the Canadian system isn't there is no single objective. And so I always tell people when we talk about make any normative statements about immigration, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what we're doing too much of, too little of, we've got to define what the objective is first. What the optimal policy is depends on what the objective is. And so for economic class immigration, that comprises about 60% of our total immigration now. It's been increasing over time. Humanitarian immigration is less than 20%. And under this government's targets, the most recent targets they've announced, it's declining. So my view is if you're concerned about humanitarian objectives, then that should be the humanitarian programs. But the problem is now we're sort of trying to achieve all these different objectives within each one of these programs, and then you end up doing nothing well.
Mike, how would you answer the question?
Yeah, I would answer it basically the same way, that we have competing and conflicting objectives. A lot of as Mikhail points out, a lot of the immigration has been focused more on the economic side, and we've had some real fundamental changes on the economic side over the last 10 to 15 years. That traditionally economic class immigrants tend to be about 28 or 29, and they make the decision to come over here when they're in a different country. And there's some challenges with that. Some of the challenges are with credentials recognition, if they went to school overseas, or with culture, adapting to a new culture. So starting with the Harper government, made some decisions over time to have people come over at 18 and 19, get their degree or diploma here, and then get permanent residency, which allows you to get past those things. But again, you've got all of these competing objectives, and it's not always clear what this government is trying to accomplish.
Okay, let's try this question directly. Does increasing immigration inherently improve the economy?
So then that's the nice follow-up question, Steve, because if we have economic class programs, and we've got to define what the economic objective is. And if you've done any strategic planning exercises, you know that the way you do that is you set an objective, but then you also say, how are we going to measure this thing? How are we going to evaluate whether we're being successful? And that really puts you in a corner, because you've got to define clearly what is this economic objective. And there isn't just a single economic objective. For economists, and I've thought a lot about this, I've worked in this area for about 2 decades. For economists, the objective that makes the most sense is the idea that we're going to try to leverage immigration to raise GDP per capita. That's kind of like the average economic living standards in the population. So the question is, can we do that? And I can talk about this for hours, Steve. I don't want to bore your viewers. But I think the simplest way to think about this is, the amount of output GDP depends on 2 things mainly: your labor input in the economy and the capital input. The capital input includes all kinds of things: machinery and equipment, the factories, all the public infrastructure, schools, hospitals, even residential housing includes all of that stuff. We know that if we double the population and we double the capital, our output will roughly double. Then GDP per capita stays exactly the same. So mostly immigration doesn't do much to GDP per capita. There are ways that we can increase it, but the problem we're having now is what we tend to do is we increase the immigration, but the capital stock does not increase commensurately. And that puts downward pressure on GDP per capita.
Dina.
So I wasn't sure if I actually really understood any of that, to be honest. But what I'm going to talk about is actually what happens to the people, right? I mean, I think that regardless of objectives, regardless of the purposes of different programs, what I'm interested in talking about is what actually happens to people when they come into this country. And right now what we have is, and we have the evidence of past immigration policies to look at. That's not looking at objectives, that's looking at actually what has happened to people when they've come into this country. And so when we look at the history and all the apologies that federal governments have given over the years, what we have is a systematic legacy of immigration policy that is quite racist, that is based on excluding certain groups because they were not desirable or palatable to come into this country. And
for instance?
So I think that we can see how the Japanese community, how the Chinese community, how the South Asian community was brought in only through indentured programs programs. We see the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, where for over 50 years, we have farm workers coming into this country year after year after year, not able to get citizenship and tied to their employers. We see the same thing with care workers. And so we have an immigration policy that's based on bringing almost 1.2 million people into this country every year on temporary permits, right? The International Mobility Program. We have workers coming in through the International Student Program, the TFW program. And so what
Temporary foreign workers.
so what we're saying though is that our immigration system should be based on fairness, justice, on allowing people to come into this country to prosper, to be able to get permanent residency on arrival so that they are not subjected to the kinds of economic and exploitative conditions that we are seeing every day.
And it's not as colorblind as you wish it were.
It is absolutely not colorblind, and the evidence shows that.
Mike, you wanted to react to Mikkel's comment?
Yeah, no, just I think we're in violent agreement on this one. That on immigration, you will tend to raise GDP, obviously, because you have a lot of people, but that doesn't necessarily raise GDP per capita. But I think there's more to life than that. That the economic side of it is important, but I absolutely agree with Alfred that we cannot lose sight of the humanitarian side of immigration.
Absolutely. And if I can add to that,
please.
I think part of the problem we're experiencing and talking about it comes from when you look at it purely through an economic lens, right? You reduce the whole problem into a math problem. I need X number of people to fill X number of spots, so I bring in X number of people. But going back to what Dina just said, it's not just about how many people you bring in, right? It's about whether those people experience life that way they should once they enter the country. And so, we talk about things like, are we making it easy for people to get their foreign credentials recognized in a fair and just way? Are we still, when we are still seeing a very significant earnings gap, right, that immigrants are experiencing, right? So the social justice issues cannot be divorced from the economic issue, because if you take that narrative further, then it becomes a breeding ground for a mindset that says, we bring certain people in because they are useful to us. We need certain things done, so we bring them in to do it. And that's a mindset that easily breeds into things like discrimination and racism that we're seeing, rampant still, right, in our communities.
Mike, do you think immigration numbers are going up in part because the government has an interest in keeping workers' wages down?
There's certainly that conspiracy theory out there, and you do see the business lobby being one of the more vocal lobbies to keep those numbers up. But the effect of immigration on wages is complicated because there's both a demand and supply element to it. That yes, you are raising the number of workers, but you're also raising the number of consumers, so that firms can produce more. So then they need to hire more. So that relationship is not one-to-one, and it really depends on the types of skills, the decisions that companies make in. But yeah, you do often hear that robust immigration targets are used to tamp down on wages, and that's not entirely right, but that's not entirely wrong either.
Well, if you're calling it a conspiracy theory, that makes me think you don't think it's all that cool a theory. Is that fair to say?
Well, I don't think the business groups advocating for it necessarily see it that way. I mean, I think they're more seeing it as a need to fill in spots or things like that. So I would like to think that they're not that cynical, but I can't read people's minds and know where they're coming from.
But wages get suppressed,
Yes.
and conditions get worse for workers if they're tied to their employers, right? And I think the system of bringing workers into the country, where workers, their ability to have a voice, their ability to speak out, their ability to say something, where their employment and their ability to stay in the country and their housing is dependent on the employer, that is what's problematic. And so the thing is that we need to be able to have migrants come into the country not tied to a sector, not tied to an employer, and those are the things that make it incredibly difficult for people to speak out. We also have legislation, though, that is passed in this province that keeps the conditions really bad. It is completely legal to pay a farm worker less than minimum wage, to not have daily rest periods, not be able, to make them work 90 hours a week. We have labor policies and immigration policies that are suppressing wages and not allowing workers to be able to organize. And so it is that those can be fixed. Those can be fixed to raise wages and working conditions.
Well, Mikhail, let's try this. We know right now, we've seen lots of studies that show that we need more PSWs, personal support workers, here in the province of Ontario. We need more early childhood educators as well. These tend to be relatively low-paid, female-dominated positions. If the government wants to bring in people to fill those jobs, wouldn't they be filled if we pay? I shouldn't ask the leading question. I should keep it more neutral. Would those jobs be filled if we simply paid people more to occupy them who are already here?
It's not only people that are already, working in these areas. The wages that are offered in particular occupations affects people's choices about what kind of occupations, young people, when they make a decision about whether to go to a college program to become a social worker or personal support worker, they look at those, they know what those wages are, Steve. They know where the increases are, right? That affects people's choices about the skills they invest in. So yeah, letting markets do what they're good at. Markets are not good at everything, but competitive markets are good at some things. And I think when we think about, wage suppression of immigrants, let's not confuse ourselves and we think that people's nominal actual hourly wage rates are getting pushed down. It isn't about that. It's about what would, do they grow in a different way than they would have if we didn't have the same immigration inflows. And not all workers are adversely affected. The workers that are most adversely affected by this competition are going to be workers who are competing for the same types of substitute workers, right? And very often those are actually, other immigrants. So the new immigrants are most likely to be affecting people who are looking for jobs, searching for housing in the same communities, in the same labor markets. Those are the folks who are usually most adversely affected.
And I should ask you, Dina, the flip side of that, which is presumably we would not be bringing in as many immigrants to fill these PSW jobs and so on if there were Canadians who were already here who wanted them in the numbers in which we need them. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, the thing is that there are many migrant workers who are undocumented who are doing those PSW jobs and working through recruiter agencies right now and are actually being paid terrible wages and being treated terribly because we are waiting still for the regularization program that the federal government is supposed to be announcing to provide PR for undocumented workers. We have about 500,000 workers in this country that need to get that protection right now. And so the thing is that when you have a system, we have had the rise of precarious employment for all workers over the last 30 years has been astronomical. We've seen increase in part-time jobs, temporary jobs. We've seen the rise of temporary agencies. We've seen wages deteriorate for a lot of low-wage workers. Right now, the Ontario government just got rid of paid sick days. So the kinds of conditions in those workplaces. Yes, but if you are a PSW and you're sick, do you want that person to be staying at home? I think so, right?
Gotcha.
You don't want them to be going into someone's home sick and not being able to take a day off because they're not going to get paid. And so the thing is, it's about looking at the whole picture. And I think we need to realize that the rise of precarious employment, the kinds of immigration rules and regulations that are stopping workers from having a voice at work and not giving PR upon arrival is making a situation that's really difficult. At my center, I'm receiving about 100 to 150 calls every week of unpaid wages, of wage theft, of discrimination, of poor working conditions, of violations. Are we okay with that? I don't think so.
No, nobody's
right?
okay with
We're
that.
not okay with that. And so we need to be able to look at the whole picture and not define things by GDP and economics and this, but look at actually what is happening on the ground. And I would say, come on our emergency hotlines on a daily basis and take a look at the calls that we get. And I think that you would be joining with me in this call for status upon arrival.
Okay, let's talk some housing here, shall we? Sheldon, would you mind playing the clip of Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland? Thanks.
The core problem with housing in Canada is we just don't have enough housing. It's just a mathematical thing. Canada has the fastest growing population in the G7. That is fantastic. That is actually a huge driver of economic growth, and it is one of Canada's competitive advantages. But we cannot have the fastest growing population in the G7 without also having the fastest growing housing stock in the G7. And we don't have that right now. We have a shortage of homes.
Let's tackle this from this angle. Alfred, is it responsible for the federal government, for example, to say, we want 500,000 new people coming to this country every year within a couple of years, even though we may not be able to actually have homes for them? Is that responsible?
I find it interesting that, and I think the housing conversation is a reflection of that. Quite often when we look at immigration, immigrants are either looked upon as a easy solution to a deep-rooted problem we have, or sometimes they're targeted as a problem that is really, it goes much more deeper and more systemic than that. I think the housing situation is a perfect example of that. The truth of the matter is, even if you shut down immigration tomorrow, we will still have a housing crisis.
Absolutely.
Right? And the clearest evidence of that is throughout the pandemic years where, because of border closures and things like that, incoming immigration has drastically reduced. We still have a housing crisis. So I think when we look at the question whether it is responsible or fair for the government to say that, I like to take a different angle in that we don't have a choice but to be committed to bringing in immigrants for the economic reasons, population growth reasons, market reasons. So that's not a should we or should we not. We don't have a choice. And the point now is, okay, we need to do this, but we need to realize that it's not about how many people you bring in, right? We talk about the systemic supports, like housing being one of them. Housing, the housing situation, economically speaking, it's a supply and demand issue, right? And so often we blame the immigrant part of the equation as raising the supply, raising the demand. But the reality is there are systemic, historic, political reasons that created this immense shortage of supply that we're seeing.
Right, and not to mention inflation.
Absolutely.
Shortage of workers, interest rates. I mean,
Lack of rent control.
Right.
Lack of affordable housing being built by all levels of government.
Right.
And so, everyone is having a crisis in housing. And I think that what I get worried about is that when we start looking at the so-called burdens on services or the burden on housing, that then immigrants get brought into the picture, right? And I think we have to be careful about that, because what we're seeing on the ground, we've seen a huge increase in anti-Asian racism around the pandemic. We're seeing rising Islamophobia. We're seeing
okay, Dean, I take your point, but I want to get back to the original question, which is how, and Mike, you tackle this. How responsible is it to bring large numbers of people over here if you haven't got places for them to stay?
Well, I think it's how we're doing it. So the fact that we announce, the federal government announces these targets with almost no notice, right? That if you're a city, you are trying to figure out your planning, your zoning, your land use based on population projections. Well, that's hard to do when first of all, the government announces these changes in targets with very little notice. Second of all, there's no sort of coordination with the colleges and universities. So if I'm mayor, I don't know how many students the college or university is going to bring in, so I can't plan that. And then third, if I'm the mayor and I'm looking at population forecast by the federal and provincial government, they haven't even updated their own forecast with those immigration targets. So it's, we had a report at SPI called Forecast for Failure, where we are making these decisions on the immigration side, and then these other decisions on the planning side, and they don't talk to each other, they don't interface with each other, and there's absolutely no coordination. So, and it's a classic Canadian problem. We have that problem in healthcare and other areas as well, where one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing.
I would have assumed, Mikhail, at some point the federal government would have put all of their smart people in a room, done all the number crunching, and landed on the $500,000 number, 500,000 number, excuse me, it's more than $500,000, because they would have said, well, given that input and that input and that input and that input, 500,000 is the right number. Do they do that?
They did that.
And that's why they're at $500,000.
Well, that was Trudeau's economic council on economic growth, right? His advisory council on economic growth was led by Dominic Barton and had a number of people on it. Had one economist, Chris Reagan at McGill. I questioned. I wasn't sitting in that room, Steve, but I questioned what the discussion was. And from what I heard in some of the testimony recently from Dominic Barton, there was some people that weren't entirely comfortable with the targets they were.
I mean, we talk about who was in the room, who wasn't. The Ontario Minister of Housing was not in the room. And yet he's the guy who's supposed to come up with a plan to build 1.5 million homes by the end of the decade.
Precisely.
Right. So, okay, so it's not just
So there
me.
wasn't, I mean, I'm completely with Mike. There was not adequate planning for this. This is not about blaming immigrants. Absolutely not. But when you increase, they're planning. So the way that we should think about these numbers, Steve, is I'd avoid the 500,000. These numbers are kind of hard to get a sense of, and comparing over time, it doesn't make much sense. We should think about immigration as a percentage of the existing population. So that number for many years, for about 2 decades, was about 0.8%. And we were doing well. That was kind of chugging along in the background. You don't want immigration to be controversial. You don't want it to be in the headlines, and it was doing that quite well. They're increasing from 0.8% to 1.2%. over a very short period of time. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the entire capital stock, not just housing, but all the machinery and equipment per worker in Canada is falling right now. So I think you're exactly right. There was not enough planning, and there wasn't enough economists in the room, in my view.
Alfred.
And I think the housing conversation is demonstrative or a good example of something very fundamental that we struggle with, right? Housing is not the kind of problem that you can solve in a year, right? Yeah. And it takes multiple players working together. Part of our struggle is that, we have the 3 levels of government, and then the question becomes, well, is it your problem, or is it my problem, or is it his problem? When an immigrant comes into the country, that's one of their struggles, figuring out who to go to for what and who does what. And so I think part of the issue that we're facing now, I mean, even with a situation when we bring in newcomers from Ukraine, given the recent crisis, right? Figuring out who is supposed to pay for the bills for the hotel rooms, right? Is it a municipal issue? Is it a provincial issue? Should it come from the feds? And so it becomes this issue that gets bounced back and forth and back and forth. And so this lack of cohesive planning that needs to happen to solve, and by the way, when we talk about immigration and housing, on average, in Canada's major city, immigrants own less than 40% of homeowners are immigrants. So it's definitely not a immigrant-driven solely problem.
Well, here's why it's a problem. And Sheldon, I'm on the top of page 4 here. Can you bring this up? This is National Post columnist Tristan Hopper, who tweeted the following recently. He said, Canada is the most singularly pro-immigration country on earth. It's easily our most admirable national trait. But if the current government was actively trying to awaken Canadian anti-immigration sentiment, it's hard to see what they would be doing different. Okay, let's get into this. I wonder, are you concerned that we are risking anti-immigration backlashes here because we're increasing the numbers of people we're allowing in, we're not increasing the services and or the housing that's waiting for them when they get here?
We've been experiencing an anti-immigrant backlash for decades. We have seen the rise of a lot of hate groups across the country. So if you look at it from a human rights perspective, we are seeing across the country, we have report after report that shows that anti-hate and anti-racist attacks have increased on our immigrant communities.
Yeah, but Dina, the polls also show there's a high acceptance of immigration in this country, higher than anywhere in the world.
Well, yes, and that's great, but the thing is how are we bringing in people into the country? Are we bringing in people with the same rights as regular folks who are living in this country? No, we're not. We're bringing people in tied to employers. And so the issue for me is how are we making sure that people get to come into this country and actually have human rights, have the freedom of mobility, have the freedom of choice and voice in terms of being able to do the work that they want to do? And so our immigration policies are not matching up with the pro-immigrant sentiment. And I think that that's a good thing. But I also think we also need to realize that our communities on the ground are also experiencing a lot of attacks, and I think I could just name a whole bunch of the attacks where we're seeing
people read the papers. We know what's going on.
Absolutely. So you know what's going on. So it doesn't feel that way to a lot of our communities, and especially when you see the types of jobs that migrants are doing and being forced into low-wage work.
Okay. Mikkel, let me get you on that. The tweet raises the issue of whether or not our policies are risking the generally pro-immigration consensus we have in this country. What are you seeing?
So I think for me, my worry is the absolute numbers, but it's actually more than that, Steve. It's about the composition of the inflow. So what we're seeing this government doing is very clearly moving away from prioritizing high-skilled immigrants to plugging holes in the labor market with lower skilled workers. What tends to happen in an economy is when you increase low skilled immigration, it puts pressure, if anything, on wages at the bottom end. That tends to increase inequality. I think a huge part of the success of the Canadian immigration system is that we've historically had the luxury, because we've kind of got closed borders and we can pick and choose who we want. There's far more people in the queue than we have kind of allow. And we target the high-skilled immigrants. If anything, that puts pressure at the top end of the labor market. And that tends to reduce inequality, right? So lower-skilled workers that are here and our voters don't look at immigrants and say, well, these people are competing with me. They look at them and say, these are my doctors, these are my scientists, these are the people who make my life better. And that's a huge part of the success of this system in Canada. And there is very strong public support for immigration in Canada overall.
Alfred?
A number of years ago, the Conference Board of Canada did a study with McGill University. And the study is called, Are We Good or Are We Lucky? And it challenges this public notion that there's huge pro-immigration sentiment within the Canadian population. The shocking thing the study found was that the anti-immigrant sentiment is such very much alive and well. The survey asked questions like, would you be in favor of the government completely shutting down immigration? And almost half the sample that was surveyed respond positively to a statement like that. And so I think, going back to what Dina was saying earlier, those sentiments always exist, and it's looking for these sort of flashpoints to set it off, right? Like COVID became a prime example of that. And then going back to what Miguel is saying, I think what we need to do is that when we bring in people, we attack it, or we look at the situation at a systemic level, right? And it's not just about plugging numbers. It's not just about a math equation. I need X number of thousands of people. I bring in X number of thousands of people, and I think that's something. Going back to that tweet. It's here, right? It's we are a compassionate nation. We are a welcoming nation. All those things are true, but let's not kid ourselves. Like, that style of sentiment has always existed. It exists, and every time we see a situation that can become a setting off, a flashpoint, we see that coming up to the surface.
You have nicely encapsulated what the whole debate is about, which is great because we're out of time. So there we go. That's Alfred Lam and Mike Moffat on that side of the table, Mikhail Skutterud and Dina Ladd on the other side of the table, and we're grateful to all four of you for coming into TVO tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.